The cabin sat nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, where November winds carried the first whispers of winter down from peaks that had seen 1,000 seasons come and go. Snow fell soft and steady outside the frosted window panes, each flake catching the amber glow of firelight before disappearing into the growing blanket of white that covered the Montana wilderness. Inside, the air hung thick with warmth and the familiar scent of pine smoke and pipe tobacco. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its flames dancing shadows across walls lined with the accumulated memories of a lifetime lived hard and long. Elk antlers mounted above the mantel, a Winchester rifle, its stock worn smooth by decades of handling, resting in its rack by the door. And on the eastern wall, illuminated by the flickering light, a small silver cross hung upon a square of faded red velvet. Silas Brennan sat in his rocking chair, the same chair that had creaked beneath his weight for 30 years now. 79 winters had carved their passage into his face, etching deep lines around eyes that still held the sharp clarity of a man who had survived when others had not. His hair had gone white as the snow outside, thin now, and combed back from a weathered forehead spotted with age. But his hands, though gnarled and liver-spotted, still possessed a steadiness that belied their years. His left hand rested on the arm of the chair, and even in the dim light, the scar was visible. It ran from the back of his hand down to his wrist, a twisted rope of pale tissue, where fire had once kissed the flesh and left its permanent mark. The tip of his little finger was missing, severed at the first knuckle, a small amputation that had saved his life when the burned flesh had begun to rot. He rubbed the scar absently, as he often did when his mind wandered back through the corridors of memory. 41 years that scar had been with him. 41 years since the night that changed everything. The door to the back room opened, and Marcus stepped through. 18 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same brown hair his father had worn before the war took him. The boy wore his cavalry uniform fresh from the tailor in Helena, the brass buttons catching firelight as he moved. Tomorrow he would ride east to Fort Laramie to begin the military career he had dreamed of since childhood. Marcus crossed the room and settled onto the footstool beside his grandfather's chair, his young eyes bright with anticipation and something else. Something that might have been fear, though he would never admit it. "Grandfather," Marcus said, his voice carrying the slight tremor of a question he had wanted to ask for years. "That cross on the wall, you never let anyone touch it. Mother says it belonged to a nun. But you—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You never went to church. Not once in all the years I can remember." Silas did not answer immediately. His eyes moved to the cross, and in its silver surface he saw not his own reflection, but the face of a woman long dead. A face that had looked upon him without judgment when judgment was all he deserved. "And the blanket," Marcus continued, emboldened by his grandfather's silence. "The gray wool one you keep in the cedar chest. You fold it every month, careful as if it were made of gold. But it is just old cloth worn thin in places. Why do you keep it?" Silas's hand stopped moving on the scar. He drew a long breath, feeling the weight of years settle into his bones. "You leave tomorrow," he said finally, his voice rough with age but steady. "You ride off to become a soldier, to wear a uniform and carry a weapon and follow orders that might one day ask you to give your life." He turned to look at his grandson, and in that look was something the boy had never seen before. A vulnerability, a need to be understood before it was too late. "You will face choices out there, Marcus. Choices that will define the man you become. Some will seem small in the moment, but will echo through the rest of your days. Others will feel like the weight of the whole world pressing down on your shoulders, demanding an answer you do not have." He paused, and the fire popped and crackled in the silence. "Before you go, I want to tell you a story about that cross, about that blanket, about the greatest debt I ever owed and how I spent 10 years carrying it before I had the chance to repay it." Marcus leaned forward, his uniform creaking with the movement. "What kind of debt?" Silas smiled, though there was sadness in it. "The kind that cannot be paid with gold or silver. The kind that can only be paid with a life lived different than before." He looked into the fire, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown distant, traveling back through 4 decades to a younger man who had not yet learned what mercy truly meant. "It begins in the winter of 1868. I was 38 years old. A horse thief, a robber, a man who lived outside the law because I had forgotten how to live within it. And on a November night, much like this one in the mountains they call the Medicine Bow, I died. He paused. And then a woman I had never met brought me back to life. The fire crackled, snow tapped against the window glass, and Silas Brennan began to tell the story he had never told anyone. The wind came down from the peaks like the wailing of the damned. Silas Brennan urged his horse forward through snow that had risen past the animal's knees. His coat pulled tight against a cold that cut through leather and wool as if they were made of paper. The blizzard had descended without warning, 3 hours past transforming the Medicine Bow Range from a navigable wilderness into a white hell, where a man could lose his direction and his life in equal measure. Behind him, somewhere in the swirling chaos of snow and wind, lay the evidence of his crime. 20 horses stolen from a Union Pacific freight wagon 2 days prior. Fine animals, every one of them worth enough money to keep a careful man comfortable for a year or more. He had planned to drive them south to the Mexican traders who asked no questions, but the storm had scattered the herd and sent him scrambling for shelter that did not exist. His horse stumbled. Silas felt the animal's weight shift wrong beneath him, felt the sickening lurch as a hoof found empty air instead of solid ground. They were falling before he could react, tumbling down a slope he had not seen through the curtain of white. He heard the crack of bone clear and sharp above the wind's howl. The horse screamed, that terrible sound that a wounded animal makes when it knows death has come. Silas hit rock, then snow, then rock again, his body cartwheeling through space until he crashed to a stop in a drift deep enough to swallow a standing man. For a long moment he lay still. The world had become a confusion of white and gray and pain. Blood ran warm down his forehead, steaming in the frozen air before the cold turned it to ice. His left hand burned where he had thrust it into the fire of a dead branch. During his fall, the flesh seared and already beginning to blister. He tried to move. His legs responded, though sluggishly. His arms obeyed, though his left hand screamed with agony when he put weight upon it. But when he tried to stand, the world tilted and sent him crashing back into the snow. The cold was already claiming him. He could feel it creeping up from his feet, numbing everything it touched. His fingers had gone stiff. His thoughts moved like molasses through his skull. He thought of his mother, dead 26 years now, from the cholera that had swept through their Missouri farm when he was 12. He thought of his father, gone the same week, buried in a grave that Silas had dug with his own young hands. He thought of his older brother James, who had marched off to fight for the Union and never marched back, his body lying in some unmarked plot on a Pennsylvania field where men had slaughtered each other for causes they barely understood. He had no family left, no friends who would mourn him, no woman who would weep at his graveside. He had spent 20 years taking from others what he wanted, running when trouble came, killing when running was not an option. He was a thief and an outlaw, and a man who had long ago stopped believing that anything mattered beyond the next sunrise and the next meal. Perhaps this was fitting. Perhaps the mountains were simply claiming what the law had failed to take. He closed his eyes. The snow was not so cold anymore. In fact, it felt almost warm, like a blanket being pulled slowly over his body. Sleep beckoned, soft and inviting, promising an end to the pain and the running and the emptiness that had defined his existence for so long. He let himself drift toward it, and then he heard the voice. It came to him through the wind, barely audible above the storm's fury. A woman's voice, calm and clear, speaking words he could not quite make out. He thought at first that he was dreaming, that death had come and brought with it some vision of the heaven he had never believed in. But then there was light, a warm golden glow cutting through the white darkness, and hands upon him, surprisingly strong, pulling at his coat, his arms dragging him through the snow toward that impossible light. "Lord, grant me strength," the voice said clearer now. "Grant me the power to carry what cannot be carried alone." He tried to help, to push himself up, to assist whoever had found him in this frozen wilderness. But his body had ceased to obey his commands. He could only lie limp as he was hauled through the drifts, his heels leaving twin furrows in the snow behind him. The light grew brighter. The wind's howl diminished. And then warmth enveloped him, sudden and shocking, after the cold that had seeped into his very bones. He was in a cave, a shallow depression in the rock face barely large enough for 2 people, but protected from the wind and snow by a narrow entrance that nature had carved countless centuries ago. A small fire burned against the back wall, its flames fed by dried branches and dead grass. The warmth radiated outward like a blessing, pushing back the cold that had nearly claimed him. And kneeling beside him, her face half lit by firelight, was a woman in black. She wore the simple habit of a Catholic sister, dark fabric that covered her from neck to ankle, a white coif beneath a black veil that hid her hair. A small silver cross hung from a chain around her neck, catching the fire's glow with each movement she made. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, perhaps 35 or 38 years of age, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but possessed of a serenity that Silas had never seen in another human being. She worked without speaking, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended the wounded before. She stripped away his wet coat and his soaked shirt, replacing them with a gray wool blanket that she wrapped tight around his shivering form. She examined the wound on his forehead, cleaning the blood away with a cloth dampened with melted snow, then applied a poultice of herbs that smelled of pine and something he could not identify. His burned hand received the most careful attention. She packed it with a paste made from moss and tree bark, then wrapped it in clean cloth torn from what appeared to be a spare undergarment. The pain was extraordinary, but her touch was gentle, and she hummed a soft hymn as she worked that somehow made the agony bearable. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a directness that made him uncomfortable. "You are awake," she said. Not a question. Silas tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his voice emerged as a croak. She lifted his head with one hand and pressed a wooden bowl to his lips with the other. Bone broth, hot and salty, slid down his throat and spread warmth through his core. "Who?" he managed finally. "Who are you?" "Sister Grace," she replied simply, "from the chapel of St. Mary. I was returning from the mission hospital in Rawlins when the storm caught me." "Why?" He swallowed, tried again. "Why did you save me?" She tilted her head slightly as if the question puzzled her. "Because you were dying, and no one deserves to die alone in the snow, unknown and unmourned." Silas wanted to laugh. The irony was too rich. This woman, this servant of a God he had never believed in, had no idea who he was or what he had done. She had risked her own life to save a stranger, and that stranger was a horse thief with blood on his hands and a wanted poster with his name on it, nailed to boards in half the towns in Wyoming territory. "You do not know me," he said, his voice growing stronger as the broth worked its magic. "You do not know what I am." Sister Grace glanced at the gun belt she had removed from his waist, at the worn grips of the Colt revolver that marked a man who used his weapon often. Her eyes traveled over the scars on his face, the calluses on his hands, the hard set of his jaw that spoke of years spent running and fighting. "I see your gun," she said quietly. "I see the clothes of a man who lives outside the boundaries of civilized society. I see scars that speak of violence survived and perhaps violence delivered." She met his eyes again. "But I also see a man, nothing more, nothing less, and every man deserves the chance to see another sunrise." Silas stared at her. In all his years, through all his crimes and all his narrow escapes, he had never encountered anyone like this woman. She knew what he was. She had to know. And yet she had saved him anyway, without hesitation, without demanding anything in return. "You should have left me," he said roughly. "I am not worth saving." Sister Grace smiled, a small expression that transformed her weathered face into something approaching beauty. "That is not for you to decide," she said. "Nor for me. That is for God alone to judge. My only duty is to do what is right in the moment he has given me. And in this moment, saving you was right." She rose and moved to the fire, adding more fuel to keep the flames strong. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but within the cave, within the small circle of warmth she had created, Silas Brennan began to feel something he had not felt in years. Hope. The fever came on the second day. Silas burned with it, his body shaking beneath the gray wool blanket, while sweat poured down his face despite the cold that lingered at the edges of the cave. He drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in dreams that twisted and writhed like snakes in his skull. He saw his mother again, her face pale and drawn as the sickness took her. He saw his father trying to hold the family together even as his own strength failed. He saw his brother James marching away in his blue uniform, turning to wave one last time before disappearing over the hill toward a war that would swallow him whole. And he saw faces he did not recognize. Men he had robbed, men he had hurt, men he had killed when they had stood between him and escape. They crowded around him in his fever dreams, their eyes accusing, their mouths moving in silent condemnation. Through it all, through the heat and the visions and the delirium that stripped away the barriers he had built around his soul, one constant remained. Sister Grace sat beside him, bathing his forehead with cool water, forcing broth between his cracked lips, praying in a soft voice that rose and fell like music. He heard himself speaking in the fever's grip, heard words tumbling from his lips that he would never have spoken in full consciousness. He apologized to his mother for not being there when she died. He apologized to his father for abandoning the farm. He apologized to James for surviving when his brother had not. And he apologized to all the nameless men he had wronged, all the people whose property he had stolen, whose lives he had disrupted, whose blood he had spilled. The confession poured out of him like water from a broken dam, decades of guilt and shame and self-loathing that he had buried so deep he had forgotten it existed. Sister Grace listened without judgment. She did not recoil from his admissions. She did not condemn him for his crimes. She simply sat beside him, her hand occasionally touching his unburned one, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his madness. On the third night the fever broke. Silas opened his eyes to find the cave lit by the soft glow of embers. The fire burned low while Sister Grace slept sitting up against the rock wall, exhaustion finally claiming her after 3 days of constant vigilance. He watched her sleep for a long time. In repose, her face lost some of its serenity and revealed the tiredness beneath. Lines around her eyes and mouth spoke of sorrow born and somehow survived. He noticed now what he had not seen before, the way her hands bore calluses not just from work, but from something else. The way a hunting rifle rested within easy reach beside her pack, its stock worn smooth from use. She had nothing else. That much was clear from the meager supplies scattered around the cave. A small pack with dried meat and hardtack, a water skin, a worn Bible, and the blanket she had wrapped around him, the thick gray wool that now kept him warm, while she shivered slightly in her sleep. She had given him her only protection against the cold. She had shared her food when she barely had enough for herself. She had stayed awake for 3 days caring for a stranger who had admitted to crimes that would hang him in any court in the territory. Why? The question burned in his mind, as hot as the fever had burned in his body. He had done nothing to deserve this kindness. He was a thief, a robber, a man who had taken and never given back. Yet this woman had given him everything she had without asking for anything in return. He did not understand. He had spent his life in a world where every kindness came with a price, where every gift was a transaction in disguise. But Sister Grace asked nothing, expected nothing. She had saved him simply because saving him was the right thing to do. Silas Brennan had not wept since his mother's funeral 26 years before. But that night, lying in a cave while a blizzard raged outside and a nun slept exhausted beside him, he felt tears rolling down his cheeks for the first time in over 2 decades. He did not try to stop them. Dawn of the 4th day brought silence. Silas woke to find the wind had ceased and pale light filtered through the cave's entrance. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, every surface buried beneath a blanket of pristine white. He was alone. The fire had been built up again, fresh fuel stacked beside it to keep the flames burning for hours. Beside the fire lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth, dried meat hardtack, a water skin filled with melted snow. Enough supplies to sustain a man for several days if he was careful. And folded neatly atop the bundle was the gray wool blanket. Silas sat up slowly, his body weak but no longer burning with fever. His left hand throbbed beneath its wrapping, and he knew without looking that the flesh would be permanently scarred. But he was alive. Against all odds, against all reason, he had survived. He reached for the blanket and lifted it to his face. It smelled of wood smoke and herbs and something else, something that might have been lavender or might have been simply the scent of the woman who had worn it. He pressed the rough wool against his cheek and breathed deeply, committing that smell to memory. She had left no note, no explanation. She had simply done what needed to be done and then vanished into the snow like a spirit, leaving behind only supplies and a blanket that had no monetary value, but that had just saved his life. Silas held the blanket for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, more carefully than he had ever folded anything, and tucked it into his shirt against his chest. He would carry it with him. He did not know why, but he knew that he would never willingly part with it as worn piece of wool. He searched for her afterward. For months he traveled through the territory, visiting trading posts and mining camps, in lonely line shacks where solitary souls eked out existences on the edge of civilization. He asked after a nun named Sister Grace described her face and her habit and the silver cross she wore. But the territory was vast, and the sisters moved frequently between missions and hospitals, scattered across hundreds of miles. Some remembered a woman matching his description, passing through years before. Others spoke of a Sister Grace who had served at a mission hospital in Rawlins, but she had been transferred to posts unknown. The Catholic Church kept its own counsel about the movements of its servants, and Silas, a wanted man, could not press too hard without drawing attention to himself. Eventually, he stopped searching. He told himself that it did not matter, that he should simply be grateful for his survival and move on with his life. But he kept the blanket folded in his saddlebag, and he found himself rubbing the scar on his left hand whenever his mind wandered to that cave and the woman who had saved him without asking why. 10 years passed. 10 years of the same life he had lived before, riding and stealing and running from town to town. But something had changed in Silas Brennan. Something had shifted in the bedrock of his soul. He was no longer certain that the life he led was the only life available to him. And every night before he slept, he thought of Sister Grace and wondered if he would ever have the chance to repay the debt he owed her. The answer came in February of 1878 in a saloon called the Dusty Trail in a town called Sheridan. It came in the form of a wanted poster. Silas sat in his usual spot in the back corner of the Dusty Trail, his back against the wall and his eyes on the door. It was a habit born of 20 years of living outside the law, a constant vigilance that had saved his life more times than he could count. Even at 48, even with gray threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes, he remained alert to every movement, every unfamiliar face that crossed the threshold. The saloon was mostly empty on this winter afternoon. A few local ranch hands nursing drinks at the bar. A card game in progress near the window, the players more interested in escaping the cold than in serious gambling. The smell of stale beer and wood smoke hung heavy in the air. Jedediah Brennan pushed through the swinging doors, stomping snow from his boots as he entered. Jed was 10 years younger than Silas, his cousin on his mother's side, the closest thing to family that Silas still possessed. They had ridden together for 20 years now, through robberies and narrow escapes and the endless wandering that defined the outlaw life. But Jed's face was wrong. Even from across the room, Silas could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. Something had happened. Something bad. Jed crossed the saloon and slid into the chair across from Silas. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them, face down. "Marshal Wade gave this to me," Jed said quietly. "Said you would want to see it. Said it was personal." Silas looked at the paper without touching it. "Wade, the federal marshal. He knows who I am. Why would he give me anything except a pair of iron bracelets? He said it was not about you." Jed pushed the paper closer. "He said you would understand when you saw it." Silas reached for the paper slowly. It felt strangely heavy in his hand, as if it carried weight beyond his physical substance. He unfolded it, turned it right side up, and felt his heart stop beating. A wanted poster. Yellow paper, black ink, the familiar format he had seen hundreds of times before. The reward was substantial, $3,000, dead or alive, enough to set a man up for years if he was the type to hunt human beings for money. But the sketch, dear God, the sketch. It was rough, the work of an artist with limited skill and less time. The proportions were slightly wrong, the shading inconsistent. But the eyes, those calm, steady, compassionate eyes that looked out from the paper as if they could see into his very soul. He would have recognized those eyes anywhere. Sister Grace Whitmore, the poster read, "Wanted for murder and bank robbery, Cheyenne, Wyoming territory." The pencil in Silas's other hand snapped. He had not even realized he was holding it. The sharp crack echoed through the silent saloon, and the men at the bar turned to look before deciding it was none of their business and returning to their drinks. "You know her." Not a question. Jed had seen his face. Silas did not answer. He folded the poster with hands that trembled slightly. Folded it with the same care he used when he folded the gray wool blanket each night, and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. "Get the horses," he said. "We are leaving." "Now, there is a storm coming, Silas. The temperature is dropping, and by nightfall—" Now, Jed studied his cousin's face for a long moment. In 20 years of riding together, he had learned to read Silas's moods, to know when argument was possible and when it was pointless. This was one of the latter moments. Whatever that poster meant to Silas, it had changed something fundamental in him. The man who sat across the table now was not the same man who had been nursing whiskey 5 minutes ago. Medicine Bow, Jed said finally. That is where we are going, is it not? Yes. You going to tell me why? Silas stood his chair, scraping against the wooden floor. He dropped coins on the table enough to cover his tab, and then some, and turned toward the door. On the trail, he said. I will tell you everything on the trail. He pushed through the swinging doors into the cold February air, and Jed followed, leaving behind questions that would wait for answers in a saloon that was suddenly much quieter than it had been before. 3 days they rode north through wind that cut like knives and cold that seeped into bones and refused to leave. Silas set a pace that pushed both men and horses to their limits, stopping only when darkness made travel impossible, and rising again before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. On the second night, huddled beside a fire in a rocky outcropping that offered some shelter from the wind, Silas finally told Jed the story. He spoke of the blizzard 10 years past, of the horse that broke its leg, and the fall that nearly killed him, of the woman who appeared from nowhere and dragged him to safety. He showed Jed the scar on his left hand, the missing fingertip, the marks that the fire had left on his flesh. And he showed him the blanket. He pulled it from his saddlebag with the same careful reverence he always used, unfolding it just enough for Jed to see the worn gray wool, the patches where the fabric had grown thin over a decade of use. She left this for me, Silas said. It might have been the only thing standing between her and freezing to death that winter, but she gave it to a stranger. A horse thief she had never met and would never see again. Jed looked at the blanket, then at his cousin's face. You have carried this for 10 years. I have. Because you felt you owed her. Silas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. It is more than owing, he said finally. She saved my life when she had no reason to save it. She gave me her blanket when she needed it herself. She prayed over me when I was burning with fever and confessing sins I had buried for decades. He looked into the fire and the flames danced reflections in his eyes. No one had ever done anything like that for me. Not since my mother died. Not since I was 12 years old. And now she is wanted for murder. She did not do it. Silas's voice hardened. I do not know what happened in Cheyenne, but I know Sister Grace. She is not a killer. She is not a thief. Someone has done this to her, and I intend to find out who and why. Jed was silent for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been hanging in the air since they left Sheridan. What will you do when you find her? Silas looked up from the fire. His eyes, usually so guarded, showed something that Jed had never seen before. Determination, certainly, but also something softer. Something that might have been hope. I will do whatever it takes to repay my debt, he said, even if it kills me. The Chapel of St. Mary sat at the edge of Medicine Bow, a small wooden building with a simple bell tower and a white fence surrounding a garden that had long since surrendered to winter's grip. Beside it stood a longer structure, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and horsehair, where orphaned children from across the territory found shelter and education and the kind of love that had been denied them by circumstance and fate. Silas dismounted at the gate and tied his horse to the fence post. Jed hung back, watching the street for any sign of trouble. They were both wanted men after all, and showing their faces in a town with a federal presence carried risks. An elderly nun answered Silas's knock. She wore the same black habit he remembered, the same white coif, though her face was weathered by more years than he could easily count. Her eyes were sharp, suspicious, taking in his worn clothes and the gun on his hip with obvious wariness. What do you want? She asked, her voice carrying no warmth. I am looking for Sister Grace Whitmore, Silas said. I need to speak with her. The old nun's face changed. Pain flickered across it, quickly suppressed, replaced by a guardedness that had not been there before. Sister Grace is not here. Where is she? I do not know, and even if I did, I would not tell two armed strangers who appear at my door asking questions. She began to close the door. Good day. Silas put his hand against the wood, stopping the door's movement. The old nun's eyes widened, but she did not cry out. She simply stared at him with the kind of fierce courage that comes from a lifetime of faith. I am not here to hurt her, Silas said quietly. I am not a bounty hunter. I am not working for whoever is trying to destroy her. He paused, considering his next words carefully. 10 years ago, Sister Grace saved my life. She pulled me from the snow in a blizzard that should have killed me. She nursed me through a fever. She gave me the only blanket she had to keep me warm. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the gray wool blanket, unfolding it so the old nun could see. She left this with me, he said. I have carried it every day since. I came here because I owe her a debt that can never be fully repaid. But I mean to treat. The old nun stared at the blanket for a long moment. Then her eyes rose to meet his, and something in her expression softened. You are the outlaw, she said, not a question. The one she spoke of, the one she pulled from death in the medicine bow. She remembered me. She remembered everyone she ever helped. It was her gift and her burden. The old nun stepped back from the door. Come inside, both of you. We should not speak of this where ears might hear. The chapel's interior was simple and spare wooden pews facing a modest altar, candlelight flickering from sconces mounted on the walls. The old nun led them to a small office at the back, its walls lined with books and papers, a crucifix hanging above a desk scarred by decades of use. I am Sister Catherine, the nun said, settling into the chair behind the desk. I have known Sister Grace for 15 years, since before she took her vows, since she came to us broken and grieving and searching for a reason to continue living. What happened to her? Silas asked. Why did she come to the church? Sister Catherine was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. Then she spoke, her voice soft with memory. Before she was Sister Grace, she was Grace Whitmore, wife of Thomas Whitmore, a Union soldier. They had a daughter named Emily, a beautiful child of 3 years when the war began. She paused. Thomas died at the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Emily died of typhus in a refugee camp 6 months later. Grace arrived at our door in the spring of 1863, half mad with grief, begging for any reason to continue breathing. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. He had known loss himself, had felt the weight of family torn away by disease and war. But to lose a husband and a child within months of each other, to be left utterly alone in a world gone mad with violence. She found her reason in service, Sister Catherine continued. She devoted herself to caring for others, especially children, especially those orphaned by the same war that had destroyed her family. She learned medicine from a doctor at the mission hospital in Rawlins, learned to treat wounds and illness with the same skill she had once used to manage a household. She even learned to shoot, to handle a rifle because the territories were dangerous and the sisters often traveled alone between missions. She became our most valuable sister, beloved by the children and respected by everyone who knew her. And her brother? Silas asked. The wanted poster mentioned. Sister Catherine's face darkened. Samuel. He was younger than Grace by 5 years, the only family she had left after the war. He worked as a miner in Cheyenne, a good man who sent money to the orphanage when he could spare it. He died 5 years ago, an accident in the mines, they said, a tunnel collapse that killed him and 2 others. Sister Catherine's hands clenched on the desk. But Grace never believed it was an accident. Samuel had written to her a week before his death, telling her that he had seen something he should not have seen, that powerful men were watching him, that he feared for his life. Silas felt the pieces beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. Victor Crane, he said. The name was on the poster. The man she supposedly robbed. Sister Catherine nodded slowly. Victor Crane owns the Gilt Edge Saloon in Cheyenne, the largest gambling establishment in the territory. But his business extends far beyond cards and whiskey. He controls the town's politicians, its judges, its federal marshal. It is said that he murdered his own brother to consolidate power, though no one has ever proven it. And Samuel saw the murder. We believe so. His letter to Grace was vague, but he mentioned the Gilt Edge, and he mentioned Crane. He said he had written everything in a journal, hidden it somewhere safe in case anything happened to him. Sister Catherine leaned forward. 3 days ago, a wanted poster arrived from Cheyenne. Sister Grace was accused of robbing the First National Bank and killing a guard. She was given no chance to defend herself, no trial, no opportunity to prove her innocence. Where is she now? She fled. She knew that Crane's men would come for her, and she refused to put the orphanage at risk. Sister Catherine reached into her desk and withdrew a small piece of paper. She left this for me, in case someone came asking. Silas took the paper. It was a crude map, hand-drawn, showing a route through the mountains north of Medicine Bow to a small box canyon marked with an X. Samuel used to live there, Sister Catherine said, before he went to Cheyenne to work the mines. It is remote and difficult to find. Grace believed she would be safe there, at least for a time. Silas studied the map, committing its details to memory. Then he folded it and tucked it into his pocket. I will find her, he said, and I will find a way to clear her name. Sister Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen much suffering and little justice. You are an outlaw, she said, a horse thief with no authority and no power. Victor Crane has money men and the law itself in his pocket. What can you possibly do against all of that? Silas stood. He picked up the gray wool blanket and returned it to his saddlebag with the same care he always used. I do not know yet, he admitted. But 10 years ago, a woman I had never met risked her life to save mine. She gave me everything she had without asking for anything in return. She believed that I deserved another chance at life, even when I did not believe it myself. He looked at Sister Catherine. His face was hard, but his eyes held something that might have been hope. For the first time in my life, I have the chance to do something that matters. Something good. I will not waste that chance no matter what it costs me. He turned and walked out of the office, out of the chapel, into the cold February air. Behind him, Sister Catherine made the sign of the cross and whispered a prayer for the outlaw who had just made a promise he might not live to keep. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson. It was small, barely more than 4 walls, and a roof nestled into a cleft in the rock where the wind could not reach. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney, a pale line against the darkening sky. Silas dismounted 50 yards out and handed his reins to Jed. Wait here, he said. If something goes wrong, ride for Laramie. Find Sheriff Collins. Tell him everything. Do not try to be a hero. Jed wanted to argue. Silas could see it in his face. But the younger man held his tongue and simply nodded, knowing that this was not a battle he could win. Silas approached the cabin on foot, his steps careful and deliberate. His hands stayed away from his gun, his posture open and non-threatening. He did not know what state he would find Sister Grace in after 3 days of running, but he did not want their reunion to begin with drawn weapons. He was 10 feet from the door when it cracked open. The barrel of a Spencer carbine emerged from the gap, steady and unwavering, pointed directly at his chest. Stop there, a voice said. The same voice he remembered from the cave 10 years ago, calm and clear, despite the circumstances. Do not move. Sister Grace, he said. It is me. Silence. The carbine did not waver. Then the door swung wider and she stepped into view. She had aged in the decades since he had seen her last. Silver now dominated the hair that showed beneath her coif, and the lines around her eyes and mouth had deepened into permanent creases. She was perhaps 43 or 45 now, and the years had taken their toll. But she was still Sister Grace, still possessed of that same serenity that had struck him so powerfully in the firelight of the cave. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes moving over his face, his clothes, the scar visible on his left hand where his glove had pulled back. The outlaw, she said finally. I thought perhaps you would come. I did not expect it to be so soon. I saw the wanted poster, Silas said. I came as fast as I could. Sister Grace lowered the carbine, though she did not set it aside. She stepped back from the doorway, allowing him space to enter. Come in, she said. The wind is rising. There will be snow before midnight. The cabin's interior was sparse and utilitarian. A wood stove in one corner, a narrow bed against the wall shelves holding dried food and medical supplies. On a small table sat a photograph in a worn frame showing a younger Sister Grace in a white dress standing beside a man in a Union uniform, a small girl held between them. Silas understood now why she had devoted her life to caring for others. She had lost everything that mattered and had rebuilt herself around service to those who had suffered similar fates. You kept it, Sister Grace said. Silas followed her gaze to his saddlebag, where the corner of the gray wool blanket was visible. 10 years, he said, every day. Why? He did not have a ready answer. He had asked himself the same question countless times and had never found words adequate to explain. Because it was all I had of you, he said finally, because it reminded me that somewhere in the world there was someone who believed I was worth saving, even when I did not believe it myself. Sister Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she moved to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered pot, handing one to Silas before settling onto a wooden crate that served as a chair. I should not have let you come here, she said. You are in danger simply by being near me. Crane's men are searching everywhere. Bounty hunters with the promise of $3,000 are combing every trail in the territory. I know. And you came anyway. I owe you my life, Silas said. You saved me when you had no reason to save me. You gave me your only blanket. You nursed me through a fever while I confessed sins I had buried for 20 years. He met her eyes. That is not a debt that can be dismissed because the repayment is dangerous. Sister Grace looked at him with an expression he could not read. Gratitude, perhaps, or sorrow, or something else entirely. I never asked for repayment, she said softly. I never wanted you to feel indebted. I saved you because it was right, not because I expected anything in return. I know, Silas said, but I am here anyway, and I am not leaving until I find a way to clear your name. For the first time since he had arrived, something that might have been hope flickered in Sister Grace's eyes. The evidence Samuel gathered, she said, the journal he kept. It is still in Cheyenne in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank. He trusted me with the key before he died. She reached into the collar of her habit and withdrew a thin chain. Hanging beside her silver cross was a small brass key worn smooth by years of resting against her skin. If that journal reaches the right hands, she continued, it will prove that Crane murdered his brother. It will prove that Samuel was killed to keep him silent. And it will prove that I had nothing to do with the robbery that Crane staged to destroy me. Silas looked at the key. It was such a small thing, barely an inch long, its brass tarnished with age. But it represented everything. Proof of innocence. Proof of murder. Proof that justice could still be served in a territory where corruption had become the rule rather than the exception. Then I will go to Cheyenne, he said. I will get the journal and I will bring it to someone who can use it. Cheyenne is Crane's territory, Sister Grace said. His men control every street, every building, every person with power. If you are caught, then I will not be caught. Sister Grace studied him for a long moment. Then she rose and moved to the door of the cabin, looking out at the gathering darkness. There is something you should know, she said quietly, about the man who leads Crane's hunters. His name is Slate Boone. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I know that name. You should. You gave him the scar he carries from jaw to ear. 10 years ago in Laramie, during a dispute over horses you had both stolen. Silas remembered, a roadhouse fight that had started over whiskey and ended with knives. He had cut Boone's face open from chin to temple and left him bleeding in the sawdust while he made his escape. He has been looking for you ever since, Sister Grace continued. When Crane hired him to find me, Boone saw an opportunity. He believes you will come to help me. He is counting on it. Then he will not be disappointed. Sister Grace turned from the door. Her face was grave, but there was something else in her expression now, a softness that had not been there before. You are not the man you were 10 years ago, she said. I can see it in your eyes. Something has changed in you. Silas thought about her words, thought about the years he had spent carrying her blanket, rubbing the scar on his hand, wondering if he would ever have the chance to repay what he owed. I do not know what kind of man I am, he admitted, but I know what kind of man I want to be. And for the first time in my life, I have the chance to become that man. Before Sister Grace could respond, the night exploded into violence. The first shot shattered the window above the bed, showering glass across the narrow room. The second splintered the doorframe an inch from Silas's head. He threw himself to the floor, his Colt already in his hand, while Sister Grace grabbed her carbine and dropped behind the iron stove. They found us, she said, her voice calm despite the bullets that continued to punch through the thin walls. Silas crawled to the broken window and risked a glance outside. 6 riders in the moonlight, their horses stamping and snorting as their masters poured fire into the cabin. And at their head, his scar gleaming silver in the pale light, sat Slate Boone. Brennan, Boone's voice cut through the gunfire. I knew you would come for her. I have been waiting 10 years for this. Silas's mind raced. 6 against 2 with one of those 2 a 43-year-old nun. The cabin was a death trap, its walls too thin to stop rifle rounds, its single door a choke point where they would be cut down the moment they tried to emerge. But Jed was still outside, still hidden in the darkness with their horses. Cover me, Silas said to Sister Grace. Keep their heads down while I draw their fire. Before she could argue, he kicked open the cabin door and plunged into the night. Bullets snapped past his ears as he ran, his body bent low, his legs pumping through the knee-deep snow. He fired twice toward the muzzle flashes, not aiming to hit, but simply to force the shooters to duck. From behind him, Sister Grace's carbine cracked once, twice, 3 times its reports measured and deliberate. She handled the weapon with the skill of someone who had practiced, who had prepared for moments exactly like this one. The cabin window above the bed shattered again as Jed opened fire from the darkness beyond the clearing. His shots were wild, more noise than accuracy, but they served their purpose. The riders turned, suddenly aware that they were caught between two positions. Silas reached the tree line and threw himself behind a fallen log, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His left arm was wet, and when he looked down, he saw blood seeping through his coat where a bullet had traced a burning line across his bicep. "Sister Grace," he shouted, "the window. Go now." He saw her silhouette appear at the shattered window, saw her swing one leg over the sill and drop into the snow outside. Another figure appeared beside her, who had circled around to guide her to the horses. "Brennan," Boone's voice again, closer now. "You cannot run forever. Crane will find you both. And when he does..." Silas fired his last 2 rounds toward the voice, then turned and ran. They rode through the night, pushing the horses harder than was safe, putting miles between themselves and the cabin. Sister Grace rode behind Jed, her arms wrapped around his waist, while Silas led the way through trails he had memorized from the map Sister Catherine had given him. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, they stopped in a narrow gorge where a rock overhang provided shelter from searching eyes. The horses stood with heads lowered, their sides heaving from exertion. Jed slumped against the stone wall, exhaustion written in every line of his face. Sister Grace knelt beside Silas and examined the wound on his arm. The bullet had cut a furrow through the flesh, but had not lodged. She cleaned it with snow and bound it with strips torn from her underskirt, her hands as steady and sure as they had been in that cave 10 years before. "It will heal," she said. "You were fortunate." Silas looked at his bandaged arm, then at her face. In the pale morning light, he could see the fear she was trying to hide. The weariness, the despair of a woman who had spent 5 years waiting for justice that never came, and who now faced enemies too powerful to fight with conventional means. "We cannot keep running," he said. "Sooner or later, they will catch us. We need to take the fight to them." "What are you proposing?" Silas was quiet for a moment, thinking through the possibilities. Then he looked up, and in his eyes was something that might have been determination or might have been madness. "Jed will take you to Laramie," he said. "There is a sheriff there, a man named Collins, who is not in Crane's pocket. He will protect you while I go to Cheyenne." "Alone," Sister Grace shook her head. "That is suicide. Crane has 100 men. Boone is hunting you specifically. You will not last a day." "I have been living outside the law for 26 years, Silas said. "I know how to disappear, how to move without being seen, how to get into places that are supposed to be impossible to enter." He met her eyes. "Let me do this. Let me get the journal and bring it to someone who can use it." Sister Grace looked at him for a long moment. In her gaze, Silas saw something he had never expected to see directed at him. Trust, complete and unconditional trust, the kind that one human being rarely grants another. She reached behind her neck and unclasped the chain that held her silver cross and the brass key. She placed them both in his palm, closing his fingers around them. "The cross was my mother's," she said softly. "I have worn it every day since she died 30 years ago. It has seen me through grief and despair and moments when I believed that God had abandoned me entirely. I cannot take this. You can, and you will." She held his hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I do not know if you believe in God, Silas Brennan, but I believe that he sent you to me both 10 years ago and now. I believe that you are meant to do this, and I believe that you will return this cross to me when it is finished." Silas felt the weight of the silver in his palm. The cross was warm from resting against her skin, its surface worn smooth by decades of faith and prayer. "I do not believe in God," he said honestly. "I never have." Sister Grace smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, there was genuine warmth in the expression. "That is all right," she said. "Perhaps he believes in you anyway." The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist. In the distance, barely visible against the white expanse of snow, a column of riders moved across the landscape, searching, hunting, relentless in their pursuit. Silas looked at them, then at Sister Grace, then at the cross and key in his hand. For the first time in 48 years, he had something to fight for. Something beyond his own survival, beyond his next meal, beyond the endless running that had defined his existence. He had a debt to repay, and he would repay it or die trying. 3 days Silas Brennan rode south toward Cheyenne, pushing through country that grew flatter and meaner with every mile. The mountains fell away behind him, their snow-capped peaks shrinking to pale smudges on the northern horizon until they vanished entirely. In their place stretched the high plains of Wyoming Territory, a vast expanse of winter brown grass and frozen earth that seemed to go on forever beneath a sky so wide it made a man feel small and insignificant. He traveled alone now. Jed had taken Sister Grace east toward Laramie as planned, riding hard through back trails that Silas had mapped out from memory. Sheriff Collins would protect her there, at least for a time. The man was one of the few lawmen in the territory who had not sold his soul to Victor Crane, and his jurisdiction provided a thin shield against the forces arrayed against them. But shields could only hold for so long. Sooner or later, Crane would find a way around Collins. Sooner or later, the weight of money and power would crush whatever resistance the honest sheriff could muster. Silas had perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less, before Sister Grace's sanctuary became her prison. 2 weeks to infiltrate a town controlled by his enemies. 2 weeks to break into a bank and steal evidence from a dead man's safe deposit box. 2 weeks to expose a murderer who had spent years covering his tracks with blood and gold. The odds were not in his favor. They never had been. But for the first time in his life, Silas Brennan did not care about the odds. He cared only about the debt he owed and the woman who had given him something precious without asking for anything in return. He touched the silver cross hanging beneath his shirt, feeling its warmth against his chest. Sister Grace's cross, worn smooth by 30 years of faith. He did not believe in the God it represented, but he believed in the woman who had carried it, and that was enough. Cheyenne appeared on the third afternoon, a smear of brown and gray against the pale winter sky. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys, mingling with the black plumes that belched from locomotive stacks in the railroad yards. Even from a distance, Silas could hear the sounds of the town, a constant rumble of activity that spoke of money being made and lost, of lives being lived and ended, of a frontier settlement that had grown too fast and too wild for anyone to truly control. He reined in his horse on a low rise overlooking the town and studied the layout with the careful eye of a man who had survived by knowing his terrain. The railroad tracks cut through the center like a steel spine, with warehouses and freight offices clustered along their length. To the north lay the respectable district, such as it was, with the bank and the courthouse, and the handful of businesses that catered to the territory's legitimate commerce. To the south sprawled the rest of it, the saloons and gambling halls, and brothels that had sprung up to serve the appetites of railroad workers and cattlemen and miners flush with money they were eager to lose. And rising above it all, 3 stories of painted wood and glowing windows, stood the gilt-edged saloon. Victor Crane's kingdom. Silas memorized the town's layout, noting the streets and alleys, the positions of buildings that might provide cover or escape routes. Then he turned his horse and rode in a wide circle to approach from the west, where a man on horseback would draw less attention among the freight wagons and cattle drives that fed the town's endless hunger. He had changed his appearance before leaving the mountains. His beard was gone, scraped away with a straight razor in cold water from a mountain stream. His worn leather coat had been replaced with a plain wool vest purchased from a lonely trading post, and his wide-brimmed hat exchanged for a cheaper bowler that a clerk or minor merchant might wear. He looked like what he wanted to look like, a nobody, a man of no consequence, someone that powerful men would overlook because he posed no threat. The transformation was more than clothing. It was posture and movement and the expression he wore on his face. Silas had spent 26 years learning how to become invisible when necessary, how to fade into crowds and slip through spaces that others would have thought impenetrable. Those skills had kept him alive when the law came hunting. Now they would serve a different purpose. He entered Cheyenne as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The streets were crowded with the evening rush, men heading to saloons after a day's labor, women hurrying home before full dark, fell children playing in the gutters while their mothers called them to supper. Silas moved through them all like a ghost, noticed by no one, remembered by none. He found lodging at a boarding house on the edge of the respectable district, a shabby establishment run by a widow who asked no questions as long as payment came in advance. The room was small and cold, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out on a back alley. Perfect for his purposes. He paid for a week giving a false name and settled in to wait for night. The real work would begin in darkness. Over the next 2 days, Silas mapped Cheyenne's underworld with the patience of a man who understood that haste led to graves. He spent hours in saloons nursing watered whiskey at corner tables, while his ears absorbed the conversations around him. He walked every street and alley, learning which roads offered escape and which led to dead ends. He watched the comings and goings at the gilt edge, noting the faces of Crane's men, memorizing their routines and habits. The bank was his primary target, but he could not approach it directly. The First National occupied a solid brick building on the corner of the main street with iron bars on its windows and a heavy vault door that would resist anything short of dynamite. 2 guards worked shifts through the night, one patrolling the interior while the other watched from a small room beside the main entrance. During business hours, the place bustled with clerks and customers, any one of whom might recognize a stranger asking questions about safe deposit boxes. He needed another way in. He needed information that only an insider could provide. On the second night, he found Thomas Miller. Miller was a bank clerk, one of the men who had testified that Sister Grace was the woman he saw fleeing the scene of the robbery. According to the wanted poster, Miller had provided a detailed description of the perpetrator, down to the black habit and the silver cross around her neck. His testimony had been the foundation of the case against her, the eyewitness account that transformed suspicion into certainty. But testimony could be purchased. Silas knew that better than most. In a territory where corruption ran as deep as the gold veins in the mountains, a man's word was worth exactly what someone was willing to pay for it. He found Miller in a dive on the south side of town, an establishment so rough that even the prostitutes avoided it. The clerk sat alone at a corner table, a bottle of cheap whiskey in front of him, his clothes stained and his face unshaven. Whatever money Crane had paid for his false testimony, Miller had drunk most of it away. The rest had probably gone to gambling debts or other vices that left a man hollow-eyed and trembling. Silas bought his own bottle and carried it to Miller's table. The clerk looked up with the suspicious gaze of a man who had learned to fear strangers, but the sight of whiskey softened his resistance. Silas poured 2 glasses, slid one across the scarred wood, and sat down without asking permission. "I hear you were there," Silas said quietly. "The night of the bank robbery. You saw the woman who did it." Miller's hands shook as he reached for the glass. He drank deep, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I saw what I saw," he said. His voice was rough, the voice of a man who had spent too many nights arguing with his conscience and losing. "Did you—" Silas leaned forward. "Because I have spoken with people who say Sister Grace Whitmore was in Laramie that night, at the Elkhorn Hotel. 6 witnesses who will swear she never left the premises." Miller's face went pale. The glass in his hand trembled more violently. "I do not know anything about that. I just told them what I saw. What you saw or what someone paid you to see." The clerk's eyes darted around the room, searching for listeners, for threats, for anyone who might report this conversation to the wrong ears. "You do not understand," he whispered. "Crane, if he finds out I talk to anyone—" "I am not here to hurt you, Miller. I am here because an innocent woman is going to hang for a crime she did not commit, and you are the only person who can tell me the truth about what really happened." Miller stared at him. In the clerk's eyes, Silas saw the war between fear and guilt, between self-preservation and the remnants of a conscience that had not yet been entirely drowned in alcohol. "Who are you?" Miller asked. "Someone who owes Sister Grace a debt, someone who intends to repay it no matter the cost." Miller was silent for a long moment. Then he reached for the bottle and poured himself another glass with hands that would not stop shaking. "Rafe Dalton," he said finally. "He was one of Crane's men. A courier ran money between the Gilt Edge and the suppliers down in Denver. He had a gambling problem, owed Crane nearly $8,000 that he could not pay." Silas felt the pieces beginning to connect. He robbed the bank to clear his debt. He robbed the bank to get away, planned the whole thing himself, shot himself in the shoulder to make it look like he was a victim, meant to take $12,000 and vanish to California or Mexico or wherever men like that go when they run. Miller's voice dropped even lower. But he bled out in the vault before he could escape. The wound was worse than he expected. By the time anyone found him, he was dead and the money was still there. And Crane needed someone to blame. Crane needed to close a loop, Samuel Whitmore had seen too much, knew too much about things that happened at the gilt edge. When Dalton died, Crane saw an opportunity. Frame the sister, eliminate the last person connected to Whitmore, tie up all the loose ends in one neat package. Silas leaned closer. The $12,000, where is it now? Still in the bank, in the vault. Crane has not touched it because taking it would raise questions. But everyone knows. Miller stopped, his eyes widening as he looked past Silas toward the door. Silas did not need to turn around. He felt the change in the room, the sudden silence that fell over the other patrons, the tension that always accompanied dangerous men entering a space. He heard boots on the wooden floor, deliberate and unhurried, and he heard a voice that he recognized from the cabin in the mountains. Miller, Miller, Miller. Slate Boone's words slithered through the air like a snake through grass. I hear you have been talking to strangers. The boss is not happy. Silas's hand moved toward his gun, but he knew that he was already too late. Boone had brought men with him, at least two based on the footsteps, and they would have weapons drawn and aimed before he could clear leather. I was not talking about anything, Miller stammered. Just drinking. Just passing time. Is that so? Boone's boots stopped directly behind Silas's chair. Then you will not mind if I have a word with your new friend here. The click of a hammer being cocked was the loudest sound in the room. Silas moved. He threw himself sideways as the gun fired the bullet, passing through the space where his head had been a heartbeat before. His shoulder hit the floor, and he rolled, coming up with his Colt already drawn, firing twice at the shapes that loomed in the doorway. One of Boone's men screamed and went down. The other ducked behind an overturned table. Miller never had a chance. Boone's second shot took him in the chest, punching a hole through his heart before the clerk could even raise his hands in surrender. He slumped forward onto the table, his blood spreading across the scarred wood, his secrets dying with him. Silas was already moving toward the back of the saloon. He had mapped this place 2 nights ago, knew that a door behind the bar led to an alley, that the alley connected to a warren of passages between buildings that could swallow a man who knew how to use them. He fired again to keep Boone's remaining gunmen pinned, then vaulted over the bar and hit the back door at a dead run. The alley was dark, the only light coming from windows high above. Silas ran his boots, splashing through puddles of filth and melted snow, his breath coming in sharp gasps that clouded the cold air. Behind him, he heard Boone shouting orders, heard more boots pounding on cobblestones as reinforcements arrived. He ducked left, then right, then left again, moving through spaces so narrow that his shoulders scraped the walls on either side. He climbed a fire escape, crossed a roof, dropped into another alley. The sounds of pursuit faded, then grew loud again, then faded once more. For an hour he ran and hid, using every skill he had learned in 2 decades of evading lawmen and rivals. Finally, when he was certain that he had lost them, he collapsed behind a stack of shipping crates in a warehouse district, his chest heaving, his wounded arm throbbing with fresh pain. Miller was dead. The only witness who might have testified to Sister Grace's innocence, killed before he could share everything he knew. But not before he had shared enough. Rafe Dalton, the real thief, and somewhere in the bank evidence that could prove the truth. Silas pressed his hand against his arm, feeling the bandage wet with blood that had seeped through during his escape. The wound Sister Grace had tended was open again, and he had neither the supplies nor the time to treat it properly. But he had something else. He had a lead, and he had the stubborn determination of a man who had come too far to turn back now. He waited until the small hours of the morning, when even Cheyenne's endless appetite for vice had been temporarily satisfied. Then he rose from his hiding place and made his way to the telegraph office on the edge of town. The operator was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that caught the lamplight. He looked up without surprise when Silas entered, accustomed to messages that needed sending at odd hours by men who preferred not to conduct their business in daylight. Silas wrote out his message carefully, addressing it to Howard Reed in Denver. Reed was a former Pinkerton agent who owed Silas his life from an incident 7 years past, a debt that the detective had promised to repay if ever called upon. The time had come to collect. The reply arrived 6 hours later as Silas dozed fitfully in a stable on the outskirts of town. The operator's boy found him there and handed over the folded paper with the bored indifference of someone who delivered secrets for a living. Silas read the message twice, memorizing its contents, before burning the paper in a pile of straw. Victor Crane, real name Victor Crawley. former Confederate officer who had grown rich selling weapons to both sides during the war, murdered his brother Nathaniel in 1873 over control of the gilt edge, then systematically eliminated everyone who had witnessed or knew about the killing. Marshal Henry Wade had been compromised years ago when Crane paid for treatment that saved Wade's daughter from tuberculosis. The marshal was not evil, merely trapped doing terrible things, because the alternative was watching his child die. And Samuel Whitmore's journal, the document that contained dates and names and details that could bring Crane down, remained in safe deposit box number 47 at the First National Bank. The evidence was still there, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to retrieve it. Silas knew he could not approach the bank directly. After the incident with Miller, Boone would have men watching every entrance, waiting for the stranger who had been asking questions to make his move. He needed help from someone inside Cheyenne's shadowy world, someone with connections that could open doors that were otherwise closed. He found her on the south side of town in an establishment that catered to appetites that polite society pretended did not exist. Molly Tanner had been a fixture of Cheyenne's underworld for nearly 2 decades. She ran a house that served wealthy clients with discretion, gathering secrets as easily as her girls gathered coin. Nothing happened in Cheyenne that Molly did not know about, and very little happened that she could not influence if she chose to exert her considerable power. Silas had saved her life 15 years ago, back when she was just starting out, and a jealous rival had hired men to make her disappear. He had intervened for reasons he could no longer remember, killing 2 of the attackers and driving off the rest. Molly had never forgotten. He approached her establishment through the back entrance, using a code that she had given him years ago and that he had never expected to use. Within minutes, he was sitting in her private parlor, surrounded by velvet curtains and expensive furniture that spoke of money earned in the oldest profession. Molly entered wearing a silk robe that had probably cost more than most men earned in a year. Her red hair had faded to a dusky orange, and lines had gathered around her eyes and mouth, but she still possessed the sharp intelligence that had allowed her to survive and thrive in a world that destroyed most women. "Silas Brennan," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "I heard you were causing trouble in town. The whole South Side is talking about the shootout at Murphy's place. I need your help." Molly laughed, a sound with a yet much humor in it. "You need more than help. You need a miracle. Boone has half of Crane's men searching for you. There is a price on your head, now separate from whatever they are offering for the nun. $2,000 dead or alive. I need to get into the First National Bank. There is a safe deposit box with evidence that can destroy Crane. If I can get to it and deliver it to the right people, this whole thing ends." Molly studied him for a long moment. Her eyes, the color of pale jade, missed nothing. "Why are you doing this, Silas? You are not the crusading type. You have spent your whole life looking out for yourself and to hell with everyone else. Why risk everything for a nun you barely know?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Then he told her in halting words about the blizzard 10 years ago, about the woman who had saved him without asking why, about the blanket he had carried every day since and the debt he had sworn to repay. When he finished, Molly's expression had changed. The cynicism was still there, but beneath it was something else, something that might have been respect. "You have a plan?" she asked. "I need a distraction. Something that will draw Crane and his men away from the bank long enough for me to get in and out. And I need a key to the back door, something that will get me past the guards without raising an alarm." Molly smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. "I might be able to help with both. But Silas, you should know that I have already sent word to Sheriff Collins in Laramie. If this goes wrong, if Boone catches you, Collins will know everything. He can bring in federal authorities from outside Crane's reach." Silas nodded. It was a good precaution. If he failed, at least someone else would know the truth. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Molly would host a party at her establishment, inviting every person of consequence in Cheyenne, including Victor Crane himself. The promise of discretion and debauchery would draw the powerful men away from their usual haunts, and the distraction would give Silas a window of opportunity. As for the bank's back door, one of Molly's girls had been cultivating a relationship with a guard named Peters, a lonely man who talked too much when he was comfortable. She had made an impression of his key 3 weeks ago for reasons that had nothing to do with Silas, but that would now serve his purposes perfectly. They set the operation for 2 nights hence. Silas spent the intervening time healing what he could of his wound, studying the bank's layout from observations he had made, and preparing for every contingency he could imagine. He knew that things would go wrong. They always did. The question was whether he could adapt quickly enough to survive. The night of the party arrived cold and clear, with a full moon rising over Cheyenne like a silver eye watching the events below. Music and laughter spilled from Molly's establishment, drawing men from across the town. Silas watched from a rooftop across the street as carriages arrived, depositing their well-dressed passengers at the front entrance. He saw Victor Crane arrive in a lacquered black carriage, stepping out with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. In the moonlight, Silas caught a glimpse of the chain around Crane's neck, the one that held his collection of severed fingers, trophies taken from men he had destroyed. The sight sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Boone was not with Crane. That was troubling. The scarred killer should have been at his master's side, guarding against exactly the kind of attack that Silas was planning. His absence meant that he was elsewhere, watching, waiting, anticipating. But there was no time to worry about Boone. The window of opportunity was narrow, and every minute that passed increased the risk of discovery. Silas descended from the rooftop and made his way through the shadows to the back of the First National Bank. The key Molly had provided fit smoothly into the lock, and the door swung open without a sound. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him, and found himself in a narrow hallway lit by a single oil lamp. The guard named Peters was supposed to be at the party. Molly had promised that her girl would keep him occupied all night, and he would not return to work until morning. But Silas moved carefully anyway, his Colt drawn, and ready, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The vault room lay at the back of the building, behind a heavy iron door that stood slightly ajar. Silas remembered what Miller had said about the guards leaving it open for convenience during the night shift. A small blessing in a situation that offered few of them. He entered the vault and found himself surrounded by rows of metal boxes, each one numbered and locked. The air was cool and dry with a faint smell of iron and paper. Moonlight filtered through a small window high on the wall, providing just enough illumination for him to read the numbers. 45, 46, 47. He inserted Sister Grace's key and turned it. The lock clicked open. Inside the box, he found exactly what he had hoped to find. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. A stack of papers that appeared to be financial records. And a photograph, its edges worn from handling, showing Samuel Whitmore standing beside Sister Grace in front of a small chapel. Silas opened the journal and scanned the first few pages. The handwriting was careful and precise, the words of a man who knew he was documenting something dangerous. March 15th, 1873. I was in the Gilt Edge tonight when I heard voices from the back office. Victor and Nathaniel Crane were arguing about money, about control, about which of them would lead their enterprise into the future. I should have left. I should have walked away and pretended I had heard nothing. But I stayed hidden in the shadows, and I saw Victor draw his pistol and shoot his brother in the back. After Nathaniel fell, Victor took out a knife. He cut off his brother's little finger slowly and deliberately, as if he were savoring the act. Then he placed the finger in his pocket and called for his men to dispose of the body. I know now that I am a dead man walking. Victor Crane does not leave witnesses alive. But before I die, I will make certain that the truth survives. This journal will be my testimony, my accusation from beyond the grave. Whoever reads these words, I beg you to see that justice is done. Silas closed the journal and tucked it inside his coat. The evidence he needed was in his hands. All that remained was to escape with it. He turned toward the vault door and froze. Slate Boone stood in the opening, his scarred face twisted into a smile that held no warmth. A pistol gleamed in his hand, its barrel pointed directly at Silas's heart. I knew you would come, Boone said. The party, the distraction, it was all too obvious. Crane went along because he enjoys Molly's hospitality, but I knew better. I have been waiting here for 2 hours. Silas's mind raced. The distance between them was too great to rush, too short to miss. Boone was a killer, a man who had taken lives without hesitation or remorse. He would not hesitate now. The journal is worth nothing to you, Silas said, playing for time. Crane will not care about evidence that everyone already suspects to be true. He will care only that you stopped me from delivering it. Crane does not care about the evidence, Boone agreed, but he cares very much about loose ends. You, the nun, anyone who might threaten his empire. The smile widened. And I care about the scar you gave me 10 years ago. Every morning I look in the mirror and see your handiwork. Every night I dream about returning the favor. Silas saw movement behind Boone, a shadow that did not belong shifting in the hallway beyond the vault door. One of Crane's men. He could not tell, but he knew that his window of opportunity was closing. You are standing in the doorway of a bank vault, Silas said. At night, after hours, with a gun drawn. When the guards find us, who do you think they will believe? The man in the business suit or the man with the scar who looks like he just crawled out of a nightmare? Boone laughed. The guards work for Crane. They will believe whatever I tell them to believe. Not these guards. The voice came from behind Boone, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. The scarred killer stiffened, his eyes widening as he realized that he had made a fatal miscalculation. Sheriff Collins of Laramie stepped into view with his shotgun pressed against Boone's spine. Behind him stood two deputies, their weapons also drawn. Drop the pistol, Collins said. Slowly, I would hate to have to explain to the territorial judge why I scattered your innards across a bank vault. Boone's face contorted with rage, but he was not stupid. He lowered the pistol and let it clatter to the floor. How? He demanded. I received a telegram from a woman named Molly Tanner, Collins said. She thought I might be interested in certain events that were about to transpire in Cheyenne. Seems she was right. I have been following you since you left the party. Silas stepped forward and retrieved Boone's pistol, tucking it into his belt. Then he looked at Collins with an expression of profound gratitude. I thought you were staying in Laramie. I was. Then I realized that you were walking into a trap and that someone needed to even the odds. Collins gestured toward the journal in Silas's coat. Is that what you came for? Silas nodded. Samuel Whitmore's testimony. Everything we need to bring Crane down. Then we should not stay here any longer. Crane will notice that Boone is missing, and when he does, this town is going to become very dangerous for people wearing badges. They moved quickly through the bank and out the back door, leaving Boone bound and gagged in the vault. One of Collins's deputies would stay behind to ensure that the killer did not escape, while the others would escort Silas back to Laramie with the evidence. Outside, the night had grown colder. The moon had risen higher, casting silver light across the frozen streets. Somewhere in the distance, music still played from Molly's establishment, the party continuing, unaware of the drama that had unfolded blocks away. Silas paused at the edge of the alley and looked back toward the gilt edge, its windows glowing like eyes in the darkness. This is not over, he said. Crane will not let us reach Laramie without a fight. Collins nodded grimly. I know, but we have a head start, and my deputies know these back trails better than any bounty hunter Crane can hire. We will make it. They mounted horses that Collins had waiting and rode out of Cheyenne as the clock tower struck midnight. Behind them, the town slept on, unaware that the seeds of Victor Crane's destruction were even now being carried into the night. The next 3 days were the longest of Silas's life. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits, switching mounts at small ranches where Collins had friends who owed him favors. Behind them, Crane's men gave chase, their numbers growing as word spread of what had happened at the bank. By the 2nd May, Silas counted at least a dozen riders on their trail, and more were joining every hour. He read Samuel Whitmore's journal as they rode, absorbing its contents in snatched moments when the horses needed rest. The document was even more damning than he had hoped. Whitmore had been meticulous, recording dates and names and details that painted a comprehensive picture of Victor Crane's criminal empire. The murder of Nathaniel Crane, the bribery of federal officials, the systematic elimination of witnesses, the staging of the bank robbery to frame Sister Grace and eliminate the last connection to the Whitmore family. Everything was there. Everything they needed to see justice done. On the 3rd day, with Laramie just hours away, the pursuers caught up with them. It happened at a river crossing where the water ran shallow over a bed of stones. Collins and his deputies had just reached the far bank when the first shots rang out, bullets snapping through the air and splashing into the water around them. Silas turned in his saddle and saw them coming, a wave of riders pouring over the rise behind them. At their head rode Victor Crane himself, his face twisted with fury, his expensive suit stained with dust and sweat. Go, Silas shouted to Collins. Get to Laramie. Get the journal to the judge. He thrust the leather-bound book into the sheriff's hands and wheeled his horse to face the oncoming riders. His Colt appeared in his hand, and he fired twice, watching 2 of Crane's men tumble from their saddles. Collins hesitated for only a moment. Then he spurred his horse and rode his deputies following, carrying the evidence that could change everything. Silas fought a running battle back across the river, firing and reloading and firing again. A bullet grazed his shoulder, another punched through the brim of his hat. His horse stumbled on the slick stones, nearly throwing him, but he held on and kept shooting. He killed 4 of Crane's men before his ammunition ran out. Then he threw the empty pistol at the nearest rider, drew the gun he had taken from Boone, and killed 2 more. But there were too many of them. Even as he fought, they surrounded him, cutting off his escape. Crane himself rode forward, his eyes burning with a hatred that had consumed whatever humanity he might once have possessed. "You should have stayed in the mountains, Brennan," Crane said. "You should have left the nun to her fate and continued your miserable existence as a horse thief. Now you will die and she will die, and nothing you have done will matter." Silas looked at Crane. He looked at the men surrounding him, their weapons drawn and ready. He thought of Sister Grace waiting in Laramie praying for his return, and he smiled. "You are wrong," he said. "Collins has the journal. By now he is almost to town. In a few hours the territorial judge will have evidence of every crime you have ever committed. Your empire is finished, Crane. You just do not know it yet." Crane's face went pale with rage. He raised his pistol, aiming directly at Silas's heart. "Then at least I will have the satisfaction of killing you." The shot echoed across the river, followed by silence. When Silas opened his eyes, Victor Crane was lying in the shallow water, his blood spreading in a crimson cloud around him. Standing on the far bank, a smoking rifle in her hands, was Sister Grace. Jed sat on a horse beside her, his own weapon drawn. Behind them, a dozen townspeople from Laramie had formed a line, their faces grim and determined. Collins had not just ridden for help. He had gathered an army. Crane's remaining men looked at their fallen leader, then at the armed citizens across the river. One by one, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Silas slumped forward in his saddle exhaustion and blood loss, finally claiming their due. He saw Sister Grace wading into the water toward him, her gray dress soaked, her face streaked with tears. He felt her hands catch him as he fell, felt her arms wrap around him as she guided him to shore. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came," she said. "I could not let you pay my debt alone." Silas wanted to tell her that there was no debt, that he had done only what any man with honor would do. But the words would not come. The darkness was rising, soft and warm, pulling him down into its embrace. The last thing he saw before consciousness left him was Sister Grace's face, illuminated by the winter sun, looking down at him with an expression that he had spent his whole life searching for without knowing it. Peace. He had finally found peace. Silas Brennan woke to the smell of wood smoke and lavender. He lay in a narrow bed covered by quilts that someone had piled high against the winter cold. Sunlight streamed through a window frosted at the edges, casting patterns of gold across whitewashed walls. The room was small and spare furnished, with only the bed, a wooden chair, and a washstand bearing a chipped ceramic basin. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his shoulder, his arm, his ribs, places he had not even realized were injured until he attempted to use them. His body felt like it had been trampled by horses and then set on fire for good measure. "Do not try to sit up." The voice came from the doorway. Sister Grace stood there, no longer wearing the black habit he had always associated with her. Instead, she wore a simple gray dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, speaking of sleepless nights. But there was something else in her expression, something that might have been relief. "How long?" Silas managed, his voice emerging as a dry croak. 3 days. She crossed to the washstand and poured water into a cup, then helped him drink. The liquid was cool and sweet, washing away the dust that seemed to have accumulated in his throat. "The doctor said you lost more blood than a man should be able to lose and still live. He wanted to know how you managed to keep fighting." Silas thought about that question. He thought about the river crossing, the bullets snapping past his ears, the moment when he had been certain that death had finally caught up with him after all these years of running. "I had something to fight for," he said simply. Sister Grace set down the cup and pulled the wooden chair close to the bed. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at him with eyes that held a complexity of emotions he could not begin to untangle. "Sheriff Collins reached Laramie with the journal," she said. "He delivered it to Judge Harmon within the hour. By nightfall, warrants had been issued for Victor Crane and every man in his organization." "Crane is dead. I saw him fall." "Yes." Sister Grace's voice was soft. I killed him, the first man I have ever killed in my life. She paused and Silas saw her hands tighten in her lap. I have spent these 3 days praying for his soul and asking God to forgive me for taking it. He would have killed me. He would have killed all of us. I know, that does not make it easier. She looked toward the window where snow had begun to fall again. I became a nun because I wanted to save lives, not take them. I devoted myself to healing and teaching and caring for those who had no one else. And now I have blood on my hands that no amount of prayer can wash away. Silas reached out, ignoring the pain that shot through his arm, and took her hand in his. You saved my life, he said. Again, for the second time in 10 years, you pulled me back from death when I had no right to ask it of you. He squeezed her fingers gently. That is not a sin, Sister Grace. That is a gift. You learned to shoot because the territories are dangerous and you needed to protect yourself and others. You used that skill when it mattered most. She looked at their joined hands for a long moment. Then she raised her eyes to meet his, and he saw something there that he had not expected. Not gratitude, not relief, but a question, a wondering, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. The territorial governor arrives tomorrow, she said finally. He is coming to oversee the trials and to formally dismiss the charges against me. Sheriff Collins sent word that my name will be cleared within the week. And then I return to the orphanage, to the children who need me, to the life I chose 15 years ago when I had nothing left to live for. She paused, but I wanted to thank you first, properly, for everything you did. Silas shook his head. I owed you a debt. I was only paying it back. No, Sister Grace's voice was firm. You risked your life for a woman you barely knew. You rode into a town controlled by your enemies. You fought when running would have been easier. You nearly died to see justice done. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. That is not debt, Silas Brennan. That is honor. And I will not let you dismiss it as anything less. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the soft hiss of snow against the window and the distant murmur of voices from elsewhere in the building. Silas realized that he had no idea where he was, what town, or whose house had become his refuge during these 3 days of unconsciousness. Where are we? He asked. Laramie, Sheriff Collins' home. His wife has been caring for you while the doctor came and went. Sister Grace smiled slightly. She is a formidable woman. She informed me on the first day that if you died under her roof, she would never forgive either of us. Silas found himself smiling despite the pain. I would hate to disappoint her. Then you should rest, heal. The governor will want to speak with you when he arrives, and you should be strong enough to tell your story. She rose from the chair and moved toward the door, but before she left, she turned back her hand, resting on the frame. Silas. Yes. When this is over, when my name is cleared and the trials are finished, I would like you to visit the orphanage, to meet the children, to see the place where I have spent the past 15 years of my life. She paused. I think it is important that you understand what you helped to save. Silas nodded. I would like that. Sister Grace smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her weathered face into something approaching beauty. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and his pain, and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope. The territorial governor arrived on a gray February morning, his entourage filling the streets of Laramie with horses and carriages, and men in official uniforms. Governor Thayer was a tall man with a silver beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything. He had brought with him a federal judge, 2 prosecutors, and a contingent of United States Marshals who would ensure that the trials proceeded without interference. Silas watched the procession from the window of Collins's guest room, his shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages, his strength slowly returning after a week of rest in Mrs. Collins's determined nursing. He had been able to walk for 3 days now, though his movements remained stiff and painful. The doctor had warned him that full recovery would take months, perhaps longer, and that he would carry the scars of his wounds for the rest of his life. He did not mind the scars. They were proof that he had done something worth doing. The trials began the following day and in the courthouse at the center of town. Silas was called as a witness, escorted to the stand by Sheriff Collins, and seated before a room packed with spectators who had come from across the territory to witness the downfall of Victor Crane's empire. He told his story from the beginning. He spoke of the blizzard 10 years past, of the woman who had saved him of the blanket she had left behind. He spoke of the wanted poster that had brought him to Medicine Bow, of the cabin in the mountains of the night Slate Boone and his men had attacked. He spoke of Cheyenne, of Thomas Miller's confession before his murder, of the evidence he had retrieved from the bank vault. The prosecutors listened. The judge listened. The spectators listened. And when Silas finished, a silence fell over the courtroom that lasted for nearly a minute before anyone spoke. Sister Grace was called next. She took the stand in her simple gray dress, her silver cross gleaming against her chest, and she told her own story. The loss of her husband and daughter in the war, her decision to take vows and devote herself to service, her brother Samuel's letters growing increasingly frightened as he realized what he had witnessed. The day she learned of his death, the certainty that it had been murdered, the 5 years of waiting for justice that never came, and then the frame-up, the false accusation, the wanted poster that had transformed her from a beloved servant of God into a hunted criminal. The courtroom wept. Hardened ranchers and weathered miners wiped their eyes with dirty handkerchiefs. Women sobbed openly. Even the judge, a man known for his stern demeanor and implacable fairness, had to pause several times to compose himself. Samuel Whitmore's journal was entered into evidence. Page by page, the prosecutors read aloud the dead man's testimony, his careful documentation of Victor Crane's crimes. The murder of Nathaniel Crane, the bribery of Federal Marshal Henry Wade, the systematic elimination of witnesses, the theft and fraud and violence that had built an empire on blood and fear. By the time the reading was finished, there was no one in the courtroom who doubted the truth. Victor Crane had been a monster, and the territory was better for his death. Marshal Henry Wade was brought before the court the following day. He came in chains, his face gray with shame, his eyes unable to meet those of the spectators who had once respected him. The prosecutor laid out the evidence of his corruption, the payments he had received, the witnesses he had intimidated, the justice he had perverted at Crane's command. But then something unexpected happened. Wade asked to speak. The judge granted permission, and Wade rose from his seat, his chains rattling as he stood. He looked around the courtroom at the faces of men and women who had trusted him to uphold the law, and he began to confess. He told them about his daughter, about the consumption that had been killing her slowly, the doctors who could do nothing, the desperation of a father watching his child fade away. He told them about Crane's offer, the money that had bought the best physicians, the treatments that had saved his daughter's life. And he told them about the price, the gradual corruption that had transformed him from a man of honor into a tool of evil. I do not ask for forgiveness, Wade said, his voice breaking. I do not deserve it. I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I did it anyway. I told myself that I had no choice, that any father would do the same, but that is a lie I can no longer believe. He looked at Sister Grace, who sat in the front row of spectators. I helped to destroy an innocent woman's life. I would have let her hang for a crime she did not commit. There is no punishment severe enough for what I have done. The courtroom was silent. Sister Grace rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the witness stand. She stopped before Wade, looking up at the man who had nearly cost her everything. Your daughter, she said quietly. How is she now? Wade's face crumpled. She lives. She is healthy. She married last year a good man from Denver. She has no idea what I did to save her. Sister Grace nodded slowly. Then she reached out and took Wade's chained hands in her own. I forgive you, she said. A gasp went through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked shocked. Even the judge seemed stunned. I do not condone what you did, Sister Grace continued. I do not excuse it, but I understand the desperation of a parent who will do anything to save a child. I lost my own daughter 15 years ago, and there is nothing I would not have done to keep her alive. She squeezed his hands. You were wrong, Henry Wade. You betrayed your oath and your honor, but you did it for love, and love, even misguided love, deserves compassion. Wade broke down, completely, sobs wrecking his body as Sister Grace held his hands. The courtroom watched in silence, witnessing something that none of them had expected. Not justice, exactly. Something deeper. Something that transcended the cold machinery of law and touched upon the essence of what it meant to be human. The judge cleared his throat after a long moment. The court appreciates Sister Grace's remarkable capacity for mercy, he said. However, the law must still be served. Marshal Wade, you will face sentencing for your crimes, though the court will take into consideration both your cooperation and the circumstances that led to your corruption. Wade nodded, unable to speak. Sister Grace released his hands and returned to her seat, her face calm and peaceful, despite the turmoil she had just witnessed. The trials continued for another week. Crane's surviving lieutenants were tried and convicted. Slate Boone, captured at the bank, received a sentence of 20 years for his crimes. The financial records from the Gilt Edge revealed a web of corruption that extended across the territory, implicating politicians and businessmen who had thought themselves untouchable. By the time the governor prepared to leave Laramie, more than 30 men had been sentenced to prison, and half a dozen more were wanted by federal authorities. And Sister Grace Whitmore was officially, publicly, and permanently cleared of all charges. The governor himself made the announcement, standing on the courthouse steps before a crowd that had gathered from across the territory to hear the news. He declared Sister Grace a hero, a victim of injustice who had endured with faith and dignity. He apologized on behalf of the territorial government for the suffering she had endured, and he announced that a reward of $5,000 would be paid to those who had helped to bring the truth to light. Sister Grace declined the money. She asked that it be donated instead to the orphanage at Medicine Bow to provide for the children she had devoted her life to serving. Silas also declined. He had not done what he did for money, and taking payment for it would have felt like a betrayal of everything the experience had meant to him. The evening after the governor's announcement, Silas found Sister Grace sitting alone on the porch of Sheriff Collins's home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and the air carried the crisp bite of early spring. He settled into the chair beside her, his movements still stiff but stronger than they had been. "What will you do now?" she asked. Silas had been thinking about that question for days. His old life, the life of a horse thief and outlaw, felt impossibly distant. He could not imagine returning to it, not after everything that had happened, but he did not know what else he was capable of doing. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have spent so long running from the law that I never learned how to live within it." Sister Grace smiled. "Perhaps it is time to learn. Perhaps." He looked at her, at this woman who had twice saved his life and who had now taught him something even more valuable. That redemption was possible. That a man could change, could become something better than he had been, could find purpose in serving others rather than himself. "The orphanage always needs help," Sister Grace said quietly. "Strong backs to repair buildings, experienced hands to teach the older boys how to ride and rope. It is not glamorous work, and the pay is poor. But the rewards," she trailed off smiling, "the rewards are beyond measure." Silas considered her offer. A chance to start over, a chance to use the skills he had developed for survival in service of something good. A chance to wake up each morning knowing that the day ahead would make a difference in someone's life. "I would like that," he said finally, "if you will have me." Sister Grace reached out and took his hand just as she had taken Wade's in the courtroom. But this touch was different. This touch carried warmth and connection and the promise of something new. "I would be honored," she said. They sat together as the sun set over Laramie, two people who had been brought together by circumstance and transformed by the experience of fighting for justice. Behind them lay pain and loss and years of loneliness. Before them lay a future neither of them could have imagined, but that both of them were ready to embrace. The debt was paid, but the story was only beginning. 31 years passed. The world changed in ways that the young Silas Brennan could never have imagined. Railroads spread across the continent like steel veins connecting towns that had once been weeks apart. Telegraph wires carried messages at the speed of thought. Electric lights began to replace oil lamps in the cities, and horseless carriages sputtered along streets that had known only hooves and wheels. The frontier closed. The wild spaces that had once sheltered outlaws and dreamers gave way to farms and factories and the relentless march of civilization. The West that Silas had known, the West of gunfights and cattle drives and justice measured by the speed of a man's draw, faded into memory and legend. But some things remained unchanged. In November of 1909, in a small cabin nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, an old man sat in his rocking chair and watched the snow fall outside his window. Silas Brennan was 79 years old now, his hair white as the snow, his face carved by decades of wind and sun and the passage of time. His left hand still bore the scar from that night in the blizzard, the twisted flesh a constant reminder of the moment that had changed everything. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime. But it was not gold or silver that adorned this room. It was photographs, dozens of them, showing children at various ages from infants to young adults. Each photograph bore a name and a date written in Sister Grace's careful hand. The children of the orphanage, the ones she had raised and loved and sent out into the world to build lives of their own. Sister Grace had died 3 years past, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by those she loved. She had spent the final 28 years of her life at the orphanage in Medicine Bow, caring for children, teaching them, giving them the foundation they needed to succeed. And Silas had been there beside her every day, helping to build and repair and guide the young ones who came through their doors. He had never married. He had never felt the need. His relationship with Sister Grace had been something deeper than romance, something that transcended the boundaries of ordinary human connection. They had been partners in a mission larger than themselves, united by shared purpose and mutual respect, in a bond that death itself could not sever. On the eastern wall of the cabin, in a place of honor, hung the small silver cross that Sister Grace had worn for 30 years before giving it to him. Beside it, on a square of faded red velvet, rested the brass key that had unlocked Samuel Whitmore's safe deposit box and changed the course of history. And in a cedar chest at the foot of his bed, carefully folded as it had been for 41 years, lay the gray wool blanket. The door to the back room opened, and Marcus stepped through. 18 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the cavalry uniform that he would carry into service tomorrow. The boy crossed the room and settled onto the footstool beside his grandfather's chair. His young eyes filled with the mixture of excitement and apprehension that all young soldiers feel before their first posting. "Grandfather," Marcus said, "you have been staring at the fire for an hour. What are you thinking about?" Silas smiled, the expression deepening the lines around his eyes. "I am thinking about choices," he said, "about the decisions we make and the paths they lead us down, about the people we meet along the way and how they change us." Marcus glanced at the silver cross on the wall. "Mother told me it belonged to a nun. She said you kept it because the woman saved your life." "Twice," Silas said. "She saved my life twice. Once from the pun and once from the man I was becoming." He paused, his gaze distant. "Do you know why I asked you to come here tonight, Marcus, before you leave for Fort Laramie?" The young man shook his head. "Because you are about to begin a journey that will define who you become. You will face challenges that test your courage and your integrity. You will be asked to make choices that seem impossible, the choices where every option carries a cost." Silas turned to look at his grandson directly. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter how lost you feel, redemption is always possible. A man can always choose to become better than he was." "Is that what happened to you, grandfather? You chose to become better." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the falling snow. "Let me tell you a story," he said, "a story about a blizzard and a woman who saved a man who did not deserve to be saved, and the debt that man spent the rest of his life trying to repay." And so he told it, all of it. The horse theft and the fall to cave, and the woman in black, the blanket that had kept him warm, and the fever that had nearly killed him. The 10 years of wandering the wanted poster in the Sheridan Saloon, the journey to Medicine Bow, the cabin and the chase Cheyenne and its shadows, the bank and the vault, and the journal that had brought down an empire. He told Marcus about Thomas Miller, the witness who had died with the truth on his lips, about Slate Boone, the scarred killer who had hunted him across the territory, about Victor Crane, the monster who had destroyed so many lives before Sister Grace's bullet ended his reign of terror. He told him about the trial, about Marshall Wade's confession, and Sister Grace's forgiveness, about the moment when justice was finally served and an innocent woman's name was cleared. And he told him about the years that followed, the work at the orphanage, the children they had raised, the lives they had touched, the quiet contentment of days spent in meaningful labor, surrounded by people who needed them, the peace that came from knowing that every morning brought another opportunity to make the world a little better than it had been the night before. "I was not a good man, Marcus," Silas said when the story was finished. "For most of my life, I took what I wanted and cared nothing for the consequences. I hurt people, stole from them, sometimes killed them when they got in my way. I told myself that the world owed me something, that my suffering justified whatever I did to survive. He paused, his eyes moving to the silver cross on the wall. But Sister Grace showed me something different. She saved me when I deserved to die, gave me her only blanket when she needed it herself, prayed for my soul when I did not even believe I had one. She asked nothing in return. She expected nothing. She simply did what was right because it was right. And you spent the rest of your life trying to be worthy of that gift, Marcus said quietly. Silas nodded. I do not know if I succeeded. I do not know if any man can truly redeem a lifetime of sins. But I tried. Every day for 30 years I tried. And in the trying, I found something I never expected to find. What? Peace. Silas smiled, and for a moment, despite the weight of his years, he looked almost young. I found peace, Marcus, not the peace of escaping consequences or avoiding responsibility, but the peace that comes from knowing you have done your best, given everything you have fought for something larger than yourself. He reached out and took his grandson's hand. That is what I want for you, not glory or wealth or power, just peace. Marcus was silent for a long moment. The fire had burned low, casting deep shadows across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Grandfather, he said finally, the cross on the wall, and the blanket in the chest. What will happen to them when you are gone? Silas had thought about this question many times over the years. These objects, so small and simple, carried the weight of everything he had experienced, everything he had learned, everything he had become. They were his legacy, his testament, the physical proof that his life had meant something. He rose from his chair slowly and painfully, his old bones protesting the movement. He crossed to the eastern wall and lifted the silver cross from its velvet backing, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. Then he turned and pressed it into Marcus's hands. The cross is yours now, he said. Sister Grace gave it to me before I went to Cheyenne, as a reminder that even a man who does not believe in God can still do good in the world. I want you to carry it with you to remember that no matter where you go or what you face, you have the capacity for kindness and courage and compassion. Marcus looked at the cross in his hands, his eyes glistening. And the blanket, Silas moved to the cedar chest and opened it, lifting out the gray wool blanket that had been his constant companion for 4 decades. The fabric was thin now, worn almost transparent in places, but it still carried the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke that reminded him of Sister Grace. The blanket stays with me, Tim, he said softly, until the end, and then I would like it buried with me, so that when I meet Sister Grace again, I can return it to her at last. Marcus stood and embraced his grandfather, holding the old man with the fierce tenderness of youth confronting mortality. Silas held him back, feeling the strength in those young arms, the promise of the future in that vital body. I will make you proud, grandfather, Marcus whispered. You already have, Silas replied, just by being who you are. They stood together for a long moment, the fire crackling softly, the snow falling silently outside. Then Marcus stepped back, wiped his eyes, and looked toward the window. It is late, he said. I should sleep. The ride to Fort Laramie begins at dawn. Silas nodded. Go, rest. I will sit here a while longer. Marcus hesitated at the door to his room. Grandfather, yes. Thank you for telling me the story, for trusting me with it. Silas smiled. It was never mine to keep. Stories are meant to be shared, passed from one generation to the next. Now it is yours, Marcus. Carry it with you. Let it guide you when the way seems dark. Marcus nodded once, then disappeared into the back room. The door closed softly behind him. Silas settled back into his rocking chair, the gray blanket spread across his lap. He looked at the silver cross, now gone from the wall, and felt no sense of loss. It was where it belonged, in the hands of a young man who would carry its meaning into a future that Silas would never see. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back through the years. He saw Sister Grace as she had been in the cave, young and strong and fierce with faith. He saw her in the cabin, holding the carbine, facing enemies with the courage of a warrior. He saw her on the witness stand, forgiving the man who had nearly destroyed her. He saw her in the orphanage, surrounded by children, her face radiant with love. And he saw her as she had been at the end, lying peacefully in her bed, her hand in his, a smile on her lips as she whispered her final words. The debt is paid, Silas. It was paid the moment you chose to come for me. Everything after that was grace. Grace. He had never fully understood the word until he met her. had never comprehended how one person's unconditional love could transform another person's entire existence. But he understood now. After 41 years, he finally understood. He opened his eyes and looked out the window. The snow had stopped and the clouds were parting to reveal a sky full of stars. The moon hung low on the horizon, casting silver light across the frozen landscape. Silas Brennan, former outlaw, former horse thief, former lost soul, sat in his rocking chair and watched the night sky. In his lap lay the blanket that a stranger had given him 4 decades past, the simple gift that had started him on a journey he could never have imagined. Tomorrow, Marcus would ride away to begin his own journey. The Silver Cross would go with him, carrying the legacy of faith and courage into a new century. And Silas would remain here in this cabin with his memories and his peace. The debt was paid. The story was told. There was nothing left to do but wait for the ending that comes to all men and trust that when it came, he would be ready. He closed his eyes again, and this time he did not open them. The snow began to fall once more, soft and silent, covering the world in white. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the years, beyond the veil that separates this world from the next, a woman in black waited with open arms to welcome him home. The morning sun rose over Montana on November 15, 1909, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Marcus Brennan emerged from the cabin dressed for travel, his cavalry uniform crisp, his grandfather's silver cross hanging beneath his shirt. He found Silas still in the rocking chair, the gray blanket spread across his lap, a peaceful smile on his weathered face. The old man's eyes were closed, his chest still, his hands folded over the worn wool, as if cradling something precious. Marcus stood beside his grandfather for a long moment, tears streaming down his face. Then he knelt and pressed his lips to the old man's forehead. "Rest now, grandfather," he whispered. "Your journey is complete." He did not call for help. He did not summon neighbors or doctors or the undertaker who would eventually come. Instead, he sat beside Silas in the growing light, holding his cold hand, remembering the story that had been entrusted to him the night before. A blizzard, a woman in black, a blanket, a debt, and a lifetime spent in repayment. When Marcus finally rose to leave to ride toward Fort Laramie and the future that awaited him, he paused at the door and looked back at his grandfather's peaceful form. "I will remember," he said. "I will carry the story, and I will try to be worthy of it." He stepped out into the morning, mounted his horse, and rode away across the snow-covered plains. The silver cross bounced gently against his chest, with each stride warm from resting against his skin. Behind him, the cabin sat silent and still, its chimney cold, its windows dark. Inside, Silas Brennan rested at last, the gray blanket wrapped around him like a final embrace from the woman who had saved him so many years before. The sun climbed higher, the snow sparkled like diamonds, and somewhere in the vast Montana sky, two souls reunited after 3 years apart, their debts paid, their journeys complete, their love eternal. The story was over. But its echoes would continue past from generation to generation, a testament to the power of grace and the possibility of redemption. For as long as men and women drew breath, as long as they faced choices between darkness and light, the story would be told. And it would always end the same way, with peace, with gratitude, with the quiet certainty that no debt of love ever truly goes unpaid.